Hey everybody, today we're going to talk about World War I and trench warfare. Trench warfare is some of the most brutal warfare the world has ever seen. World War I is very unique in that this is the first war fought like this and really the last war fought like this. I shouldn't say the first war fought like this. There was some trench warfare in the Civil War, but it was very different. You didn't have the advanced weaponry that you have in World War I that makes things very, very different from a fighting standpoint. One of the things with World War I is this is really the myth of the war and what a lot of people thought it was going to be like, and kind of how the war was sold to those that were going to fight it, that it was going to be this good time, that you could kind of see all the happy faces here and things like that. It definitely was not to that extent. It was certainly uh, a barren wasteland, just destruction everywhere. This is once a vibrant forest, and here it's just turned into an absolute wasteland. And you can see some of these makeshift trenches here. Not all the trenches were these sophisticated, things that were built. Most of these trenches were kind of dug out haphazardly in a lot of ways, and as a result, it was not the best conditions to fight a war in. Warfare, guys, the gist of trench warfare is armies would just settle into their trenches, and every once in a while a group would jump out and charge and try to cross the area in between the enemy trenches. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But that area in between the trenches was known as no man's land, because running out there meant almost certain death. You were not going to survive. You were not likely to survive when you ran out into no man's land. Trench system itself, you would have frontline trenches, communication trenches, support trenches, and then as well as no man's land, like we talked about. So right here might be the frontline trench. Over here would be the other enemy's frontline trench, and in between would be all this stuff. And you see the communication trenches and support trenches and all of that going throughout here. As well as a lot of barbed wire you would also see, and that was something warfare there. So here's a good overhead view of what a trench looked like. You can see, kind of imagine this these army guys here, that their trench was back there and they came up, and you can see, you've got an airplane above, you've got artillery back here. Here's a machine gun pillbox. Here are support trenches, and you can see a little little area there that might get dug out in the more sophisticated ones. But these men would jump out, and if you were able to survive the machine gun fire, which is really one of the big weapons that changes warfare in World War I. If you survive the machine gun fire and the rifles all pointed at you from the enemy trench here, you might make it to the barbed wire. If you made it to the barbed wire, you might be that guy that gets sacrificed and has to lay flat on top of the barbed wire while everyone jumps across you. And then if you're fortunate enough to get to the enemy trench, you better hope there's a lot of guys with you, or you basically very, very outnumbered as a result of that. Because this is what it was like, and this is what it took to kind of gain ground, very little land is exchanged in World War I as a result of that. It is predominantly fought over about an 8 to 10 mile range that varied between who was able to acquire what territory. All right, and here's an overhead view, kind of the difference between the two trenches here. All right, here's a side view. So you can see that, the trenches could be a little high. You have a step up, some sandbags, got some cute rats over here. But this is kind of the side angle of it, and you can see there's a little water here. And we'll get to a little bit. And you can see these were what would hang out in the trenches. You got a lot of dead bodies. Rats are feasting on them. And just think of the sheer size. Look at this rat right here. Look at the size of that one. If you kind of measure this with your hands and take it down this guy's leg, you can see a rat that basically is the size of somebody's chest. So these rats are as big as or close to as big as some small dogs almost, that look like from this picture. That's how big and they could get, though. There were a lot of dangers in the trench. The trenches were really unsanitary. You have rats, dead bodies in standing water. They make the trenches swarm with disease. And one of the worst things that could happen to you is you could get trench foot. And trench foot comes when you are subjected to your feet being in water for long periods of time. You guys know, you guys have all gone through your feet getting shriveled. I'll give you a personal story here from that. Working at a bar. This one bar in particular I was working at one time, there was a clog in one of the drains, and my feet got wet, and they were wet for about 12 hours. And by that 8th, ninth, and 10th hour, it was extremely painful to stand on my feet. And that was only after 8 or 9 hours. These guys went days with that happening, and their feet would get really, really destroyed. And some of the more extreme cases, this is what could happen to your feet. All right, this is just kind of dead skin. These are, toes have already fallen off. Hopefully, you're still looking at this and not throwing up. Medical services and life-saving antibiotics, they're not yet discovered. So one of the things that World War I is really the last war with is that minor injuries that led to infections, that led to death, this is the last war that happens in. And unfortunately, in World War I, more men die of disease than anything else. That was still very prevalent as a result of that. One of the other issues with World War I is that we've got a lot of new weapons, and the machine gun is the biggest one. You often think of the Civil War, and when you see like Civil War movies, you think of what makes good action scenes is when the armies kind of clash and there's hand-to-hand combat. But that was even rare in the Civil War because the weapons had advanced so much. Now the weapons have gone even further, and the machine gun really is a big part of that. It changes warfare completely. This weapon that can just rip through people like like nothing else had before. We get our first airplanes. Airplanes are still very primitive, though, at this time. They don't become more sophisticated until World War II, where we see, better bombing and accuracy, and dogfighting becomes much more important. Tanks are getting their first debut, but again, they're not quite there yet. They're not as sophisticated to make a difference. And we even get the advent of some poison gases, and the Germans use that more so than anybody else. They used a gas called mustard gas that would really burn your skin, your eyes, things like that. So you could see troops in World War I using gas masks while they were fighting as a result of that. And the other thing was U-boats, submarines. The first submarines are used. The Germans are the best at it, and they cause a lot of havoc on the sea. To give you an example of how bad trench warfare was, there's no better example of the First Battle of Somme. Something else to understand is, this was so new that the tactics that a lot of the generals and the higher ups had learned were way behind the times. And the French in one of the early battles, they came in bright uniforms, marching side by side, and then the machine gun just starts ripping through them. And they realized very quickly that they had to change their tactics. But to give you an idea of how bad trench warfare was, the First Battle of Somme began on July 1st, 1916, and ended in mid-November. On the first day alone, England suffered 60,000 casualties. This would be an unspeakable number by today's standards. You look at D-Day, which is one of the most infamous days in our history. We lost 6,000 men on D-Day, and that was a lot. People were not, or 5,000 to 6,000. That's considered a lot. This was 60,000 on the first day. And in this whole period of time, 1.2 million people die just from this battle that ranged for a few months. You're talking about, that's double the number of people that died in the entire Civil War. And they lose that in several months. They lose double that in several months. And like I said, the big thing that trench warfare does is that very little land is exchanged. We only see about 7 miles of land exchanged throughout the entire war.